What if the line between respect and desire wasn't crossed in a moment, but slowly erased, word by word, glance by glance, until we no longer knew which side we stood on? The classroom felt different after hours. The chatter of students had long faded, leaving behind only the quiet hum of the air conditioner and the faint scent of chalk dust still clinging to the air. The sun was sinking low, painting the floor in orange strips of light that cut across the rows of empty desks. I had stayed behind with an excuse about clarifying notes, but in truth it was the silence, and her, that kept me rooted in place. She was at her desk, glasses slipping slightly down the bridge of her nose, her pen gliding across papers with a rhythm that spoke of both precision and weariness. Miss Hale. To the world, she was composed, almost untouchable. 42 years old, respected, carrying herself with the kind of grace that only comes from years of discipline. But to me, in that moment, she looked profoundly human. A stray strand of hair fell against her cheek, and she brushed it back absent-mindedly, leaving a faint smudge of ink on her temple. I pretended to flip through my notebook, but my eyes wandered more than they should have. I noticed the way her shoulders tensed slightly, as if she could feel my gaze, even without looking up. And when she did finally raise her head, her eyes caught mine, sharp, steady, and yet softer than I expected. For a long heartbeat, neither of us spoke. The silence felt like a held breath, and the boundary between student and teacher, formality and something far more fragile, blurred. She was the first to break it. Her voice was low, quiet, carrying a warning that trembled on the edge of something else entirely. "You're crossing a line." The words should have pulled me back, reminded me of the rules, the roles we were meant to play. And yet, the way she whispered them, not stern, but almost pleading, only drew me closer. My hand rested on the desk, a few inches from hers, the space between us charged with an energy I didn't fully understand but couldn't ignore. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I studied her expression, the tension in her jaw, the flicker of vulnerability in her eyes, the way her pen stilled against the paper as if she no longer trusted her own steadiness. She was warning me, yes, but she was also admitting something, that the line wasn't fixed, that it could shift, that maybe she already felt it shifting beneath her. When I finally spoke, my voice came out quieter than I expected, but steady. "You drew it closer." Her lips parted slightly, a protest half-formed, but she didn't move her hand. The light shifted again, shadows stretching across the room, and for a fleeting second, it felt as though the world outside had ceased to exist. Just her and me. Two people standing at the edge of something both dangerous and inevitable, caught between what we should be and what we were already becoming. The line was still there, but no longer where it used to be. The library always held a hush, but at night it was different. Rows of books rose like sentinels around us, their spines catching faint light from the green-shaded lamps scattered across the tables. The air smelled of paper, old and worn, and the silence felt almost sacred, as though speaking too loudly might wake the ghosts of all those who once studied here. I wasn't supposed to be here this late, but neither was she. I found her in the quietest corner, sleeves rolled up as she sifted through stacks of reference books, her reading glasses perched lightly on her nose. She looked more like a scholar lost in her own world than a teacher. For a while, I simply watched from a distance, unsure if stepping closer would feel like intrusion or invitation. Eventually, my footsteps betrayed me, and she glanced up. There was the briefest flicker of surprise in her expression, followed by something harder to define. Hesitation, recognition, maybe even anticipation. "You're here again," she said softly, her tone walking the fine edge between reprimand and acknowledgement. I smiled faintly, lifting the book in my hand as if that were explanation enough. "Research." Her lips curved into the faintest smile, but her eyes didn't lose their guarded edge. She bent her head again, pretending to be absorbed in her notes, though I sensed her awareness sharpening with every step I took closer. When I reached the shelf beside her, it happened. We both reached for the same book. My fingers brushed hers, fleeting, but enough to send a charge up my arm. She pulled back almost instantly, retreating into formality, but not before I caught the brief tremor in her breath. "Careful," she whispered, her voice low enough that the room itself seemed to lean closer to hear. "We can't keep doing this." Her words were sharp, but her eyes betrayed her. They lingered on mine too long, carrying the same unspoken pull I felt, the kind that made distance feel unnatural, as though the very air between us was trying to press us closer. I lowered my voice, matching her hush. "I'm not the one doing it." Her brow furrowed, just slightly, and I stepped closer, closing the gap not with touch, but with truth. You drew it closer. For a moment, time seemed to falter. Her hand hovered over the book, frozen, as though weighing whether to pick it up or let it go entirely. The lamp above cast a soft glow across her face, highlighting the tension. The push and pull between the woman who had spent years building boundaries and the human being who suddenly wanted them to fall. Neither of us spoke again. Instead, the silence became its own dialogue, filled with the pulse in my wrist where her skin had grazed mine, the faint hitch of her breath, the way her shoulders lifted then slowly relaxed as though surrendering to the truth she didn't want to admit. In that quiet corner of the library, surrounded by walls of books and the weight of rules we both knew too well, the line between us blurred once more. And though she turned away, pretending to bury herself in her notes, I knew she had felt it too, the undeniable pull neither of us could name, yet neither of us could resist. The rain began as a whisper, a soft tapping against the tall windows of her office. By the time I wandered past her door, it had grown into a steady rhythm, filling the hallway with a sound both calming and isolating. I should have gone home hours ago, but the glow spilling from her half-opened door stopped me. She sat at her desk, shoulders bent over stacks of essays, red pen moving with quiet determination. The lamplight painted her in soft amber, contrasting the storm's gray light beyond the glass. There was something vulnerable about the scene. A woman, 42, carrying the weight of her students' futures, alone in a building too large for one person. I hesitated, but she noticed me before I could step away. "Still here?" she asked, voice warm but tinged with surprise. I shrugged, holding up a flimsy excuse about needing to double-check my notes. She studied me for a moment, perhaps seeing through the lie, but she didn't send me away. Instead, she gestured to a chair across from her desk. "Then sit." No point in wandering the halls during a storm. I sat, listening to the rain drum harder, the thunder rolling in the distance. For a while, the only sound between us was the scratch of her pen. Then, quietly, she sighed, not the casual kind, but one that seemed to carry years of unspoken weight. "It's strange," she said finally, her eyes still on the paper in front of her. "You spend so much time shaping lives, preparing others for their future, and somewhere along the way, you stop having one of your own." Her words surprised me. I had always seen her as steady, untouchable, but in that moment, she sounded achingly human. I leaned forward, my voice gentler than I intended. "That sounds lonely." She looked up then, really looked at me. And for the first time, I saw the vulnerability in her gaze, the tiredness, the quiet longing to be understood. "It is," she admitted. "But loneliness becomes easier when no one notices, when no one asks." I swallowed, suddenly aware of the fragile bridge she had laid between us. "I noticed," I said softly. The silence that followed was not empty. It was thick with the hum of the storm and the sound of her breathing, slower now, steadier, as though she had allowed herself to exhale something she'd been holding for too long. When she gathered her papers into a neat stack, I stood automatically to help. She let me carry part of the load, and as we walked down the dim hallway, our shoulders brushed. The contact was small, almost accidental, but it lingered, a fleeting warmth in the chill of the storm. She didn't step away. "Thank you," she whispered, and though it was just about the books, I felt it meant something more. That night, I realized I no longer saw her only as my teacher. She was a woman, human, vulnerable, quietly strong, and I had crossed into the space where I could no longer pretend otherwise. Daylight has a way of stripping away the softness of night. The storm, the quiet talks, the near confessions, they all seemed impossibly far when the corridors filled with the noise of students again. Bright laughter, hurried footsteps, whispered rumors carried like echoes along the tiled floors. I saw her across the hallway, surrounded by the everyday clamor of her role. Miss Hale, my teacher again. The woman who had let her guard fall just enough for me to glimpse the loneliness beneath it was gone, replaced by the calm, professional figure I had always known. She carried a stack of books against her hip, moving briskly, her expression schooled into neutrality. But her eyes betrayed her. They flickered toward me once, brief, cautious, almost apologetic, before sliding away as though the glance itself was dangerous. I understood. In the world's eyes, there were lines that must never blur. The thought of someone seeing what I had seen, the warmth in her sigh, the way her hand had lingered in mine, tightened her posture. Even the smallest look could spark whispers, and whispers had the power to ruin lives. When I passed her in the corridor, our arms brushed. A harmless accident to anyone watching, but for me, it was a spark. For her, I saw the ripple of tension in her shoulders, the way she forced her gaze forward, refusing to acknowledge the contact. She didn't slow, didn't smile, didn't speak. To anyone else, she looked composed. To me, she looked as though every step was an effort not to turn back. It stung, though I couldn't blame her. I felt the walls of expectation pressing in, the judgment of peers, the scrutiny of colleagues, the unspoken rules that shaped every interaction within these walls. What we shared in the silence of her office or in the hush of the library could not exist here. Not under the fluorescent lights, not with 100 eyes ready to notice what they weren't meant to see. Later that day, I caught sight of her through the open door of the staff room. She was laughing at something a colleague said, though the laughter didn't reach her eyes. Her glance slid past me in the hallway window's reflection, quick and fleeting, but there it was again, that same silent apology. I realized then that the world had a way of intruding on something fragile, something still finding its shape. And though my chest tightened with frustration at her distance, I also felt the ache of understanding. She wasn't cold because she didn't feel it. She was cold because she felt it too much. The line between us hadn't vanished. It had only grown sharper under daylight's glare. And yet, behind every stolen glance and hurried step, I sensed it, the same longing, the same pull, carefully hidden beneath layers of duty and fear. And so, we moved through the day as strangers. Strangers who carried a secret, one that could neither be spoken nor ignored. The storm rolled in without warning. By the time the last of the students had left, thunder was already grumbling in the distance, and the sky had darkened into a restless, swirling gray. I stayed behind under the excuse of finishing work, though if I were honest, I lingered out of habit now because sometimes staying meant I would cross paths with her. That night, the storm grew violent. Rain lashed against the tall windows of the school, rattling the glass, while wind howled like it was trying to tear the building apart. The power flickered once, twice, then surrendered entirely, leaving only the faint glow of emergency lights humming to life in the hallways. I found her near the stairwell, clutching a flashlight, her expression taut with a mix of worry and restraint. For a moment, she looked younger somehow, stripped of the usual composure that made her untouchable. When her eyes found mine, relief softened her features, though she quickly tried to hide it. "Of course you're still here," she murmured, half exasperated, half grateful. We ended up in the library, the storm outside battering the windows, shadows flickering around us as the generator lights struggled to hold steady. It felt like the world had shrunk to just us, the storm and the silence wrapping us in a cocoon that no one else could enter. She sat across from me at a long wooden table, the flashlight propped upright between us, its narrow beam catching the sharp lines of her face. The sound of rain filled every pause between our words, until eventually words faded altogether. When the lights flickered again, she startled slightly, and her hand went out instinctively, finding my arm. The contact was brief, accidental, but instead of pulling back, she left it there, her palm warm against my sleeve. I covered her hand with mine, slowly, deliberately. I wanted her to feel not just my touch, but the steadiness of it. She inhaled, sharp and quiet, as if fighting something within herself. Her voice, when it came, was a whisper swallowed by the storm. We shouldn't, but she didn't move. She didn't take her hand away. I searched her eyes in the dim light. Those eyes that had carried authority in daylight, guardedness in crowded halls, loneliness in late hours. Now they carried only honesty. The storm outside roared, and yet all I could hear was her breathing, uneven and fragile. Then tell me to stop, I whispered back. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if the words might come. But when she opened them again, her hand pressed firmer into mine, her silence speaking louder than anything she could have said. The line we had danced around for weeks had finally fractured. Not shattered, not recklessly destroyed, but cracked just enough to let truth slip through. And in that fragile, thunder-lit silence, I knew this was the breaking point. By the time the storm eased, the school was wrapped in silence. The rain no longer roared but trickled softly, sliding down the windows in thin silver lines. The generator's hum was steady now, though most of the building still sat in shadow. We stayed in the library, sitting side by side on a wooden bench beneath the tall windows. The only light came from the moon breaking through ragged clouds, its pale glow slipping through the blinds and painting the floor in silver stripes. The storm had passed, but the silence it left behind was heavier than the thunder ever was. She hadn't moved her hand from mine. Our fingers rested together on the bench between us, hesitant at first, then slowly weaving closer until they laced palm to palm. It was a simple thing, so ordinary, yet it felt like the most dangerous, most precious act in the world. Her voice broke the silence, low and trembling in a way I had never heard before. You make me feel. She stopped, struggling, her eyes fixed on the moonlit floor as though afraid of meeting mine. You make me feel alive again, and that terrifies me. I swallowed hard, my chest tightening with the weight of her confession. Why terrified? I asked gently. She turned her head then, her gaze meeting mine with raw honesty. The guard she wore in daylight was gone. There was no teacher here, no authority, only a woman bearing a truth she could no longer hold inside. Because wanting this means risking everything I've built. My work, my name, the life I've held together for years. And yet, her hand squeezed mine just slightly. I don't want to stop wanting it. The vulnerability in her words struck me deeper than any warning she had ever given. I leaned closer, careful, deliberate, my voice no louder than hers. Then don't. You don't have to make promises tonight. You don't have to explain yourself. Just let me be here, with you. That's all I want. Her breath caught, and in the dim light, I saw her lips part as though to protest. But instead, she let out a long, unsteady sigh. Her head tipped slightly, her temple brushing against my shoulder, light as a feather. The contact stole my breath. We sat like that in silence, her cheek resting against me, our hands still bound together. The world outside could judge, the rules could shout their warnings, but here, in this fragile moment, it was just us. And for the first time, she wasn't hiding. I don't know where this will lead, she whispered. Neither do I admitted, my thumb tracing slow circles against her hand. But I'd rather not know with you than never feel this at all. The moon slipped behind a cloud, dimming the room again, but the warmth between us held steady, small, fragile, and yet unshakably real. It wasn't a grand declaration. It wasn't reckless passion. It was quieter than that. But in its quietness, it was everything. Weeks passed. The storm faded into memory, replaced by ordinary days that looked the same on the surface but carried a quiet shift underneath. We no longer lingered in empty corridors or whispered in hidden corners. The distance returned, at least in the eyes of the world. She carried herself with her usual poise. I played the part of dutiful student, and no one would have guessed that between us, something unspoken still pulsed steady and alive. It was outside of school where the walls finally loosened. A small coffee shop tucked away on a side street. The kind of place where the chatter was low and the lighting soft, almost forgiving. I had gone there by chance, only to find her already sitting near the window, a paperback in her hand, steam rising from the cup at her table. For a moment, I almost turned away, not wanting to disturb the fragile balance we had built. But then she looked up, and she smiled. Not the polite curve she wore in hallways, not the guarded glance that said we mustn't. This was softer, unmasked, a smile that belonged only to her, and maybe in that moment, to me. I slid into the chair across from her, the warmth of the room settling around us like a blanket. For the first time, there were no desks, no papers, no walls filled with rules. Just two people sitting with mugs in hand, trying to remember how to breathe freely. The conversation wandered easily. She teased me about my clumsy handwriting. I asked about the book she was reading, and somewhere between sips of coffee and laughter that came a little too naturally, the heaviness of the last weeks began to lift. At one point, a crumb clung to the corner of my lip from the pastry I'd ordered. Without thinking, she reached across the table, brushing it away with her thumb. The touch was so small, so natural, yet lingered. My heart stumbled against my ribs, and when she realized what she'd done, her hand hesitated in the air. This time, I didn't let her retreat. I reached forward, covering her hand with mine. Her skin was warm, her fingers soft beneath my palm. She looked at me then, really looked, and for once there was no fear in her eyes, only a quiet relief, as if she had been waiting for permission to stop running. Neither of us spoke the word aloud. We didn't need to. The decision wasn't a grand announcement or a reckless leap. It was the simple, steady act of choosing to stay, even when the world would not understand. In that little coffee shop, with rain still dripping from the awning outside and her hand resting safely beneath mine, I realized something. The line that had once divided us wasn't erased by accident. It was crossed carefully, step by step, until it vanished altogether. And for the first time, I didn't feel like we were breaking rules. I felt like we were finally writing our own. If this story touched you, if you felt the tension, the longing, and the quiet warmth we discovered together, then let me know. Share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe for more slow burn romances, and don't forget to hit the bell so you'll never miss the next chapter of these whispered moments.